It's a beautiful, wet, rainy day out here in the Pacific Northwest, Western Washington to be precise. And I'm just out on a trail run today, and every now and then I'm kind of stopping to poke around, see what different mushroom species I can still spot and locate out here. Now, of course, I'm not expecting to find too much. We're just coming out of our first real hard freeze. So we got a small amount of snow out here, and overall it's been incredibly mild this year. It's been a heck of a mushroom season, best that I can remember, and extended late into the season. But I believe that with this most recent freeze, temperatures dropped low enough to mark the end of what we traditionally think of as mushroom season. So not expecting to see a lot in the way of, mycorrhizal mushrooms or fruiting bodies, but I'm sure that we'll come across plenty of saprophytic mushrooms, the saprophytes, of course, being the ones that grow from dead wood. So we'll see what we see. We'll keep our eyes peeled. And of course, I'm always a fan of scouting and seeing, what's to come over the course of the next days, weeks, months. Just kind of keeping an eye out for different habitats that could be good for some of my favorite species that are come up here in the spring. So let's see what we see, and we'll check back in as things catch my eye and decide to slow down and take a little breather or get something on the video. Here, just on the side of the trail, one of my favorite winter mushroom finds. Not only is this one beautiful, it's also a really good choice edible / medicinal mushroom. Not a beginner's mushroom for sure. This is the wild Enoki, also known as the Velvet Shank or the Velvet Foot. We can see growing right next to this is actually kind of an interesting one that's on its way out called the purple Jellydisc. Got a little banana slug in there too, getting in on the action. But we can see that these wild Enokis that are up here are past their prime. So these have gotten rained on, they've gone through a freeze-thaw cycle. These are mushrooms that hold up really well in cold weather. They've actually got a chemical component that is like a natural type of antifreeze. So they don't mind a little snow, a little freezing, they're gonna do fine. But what I've noticed is that as they get rained on, they kind of have a very slimy, moist cap that's sticky when it's fresh. And that tends to accumulate water. And my kind of theory on this is that once we hit freezing weather, if there is a lot of moisture up on the top of that, even though the actual flesh of the mushroom is going to be just fine, I think that freezing of that cap and just kind of pounding of it does a number on it. So you can see that those guys are not long of this world. They're on their way out, but these are ones that I would definitely harvest and consume. So something to look for on this, it's going to have a white spore print. That's the most crucial thing to look for. This could be confused with not just toxic or poisonous mushrooms, but actually deadly mushrooms, the deadly Ganoderma, which is going to have a brown spore print and a little bit of a collar on the stem, which this does not have. So if you were to take this home and you were to do a spore print, you would want to positively ID it with a white spore print. Also, you'll notice on some of the more mature ones, you'll notice like a dark velvet forming at the base of them. That's another key distinguishing feature for that. And again, the cap, especially when young, is going to be kind of slimy and moist. Sometimes it'll have a little shine to it, so it'll really affect the way it looks. So we can see this is a nice fruiting on the edge of this log. If we look down kind of the neighboring ones, which I guess it's worth noting that this is big leaf maple. So it's covered in moss currently, and we can see little pins coming up. This is also that wild Enoki. So, and as we look further down this, we can see actually more of them starting to come up. So this is actually a spot that I've kind of been keeping an eye on because, I'm curious to see how these grow. Of course, I want to harvest and eat them, but I also just want to see their full life cycle. So I've been leaving these untouched for the most part. Here we can see an old purple Jellydisc on the left, Enoki on the right. Kind of interesting. So this one right here is actually faded in color. So when this was younger, it was a bright orange, but as it comes into focus, you might notice small little eyelashes coming off of this. This is known as the eyelash fungus. and Ascocoryne. It has little hairs coming off the cup. So again, that's like an orangish red color in its youth. I'll throw a picture up on the screen that will show what that looked like not too long ago before the freeze. So shifting our focus away from the wild Enoki into this purple Jellydisc, it's a really interesting mushroom. So it grows on hardwoods. It kind of looks similar to witch's butter and other jelly fungi, but this isn't actually a true jelly fungus, and to my knowledge, it's not edible. Really interesting one though that I'm still learning more about. So in particular, I'm reading kind of published studies from a professor or former professor, I think he still currently is a professor at University of Montana, who specializes in endophytes. He actually harvested an endophyte down in Chile that initially he ascribed a different Latin name to, but it ended up being this exact purple Jellydisc, and put that in a petri dish and observed it over time and started to notice that it was producing what appeared to be hydrocarbons that were similar or identical to diesel fuel. So this is the mushroom that's at the root of the famed Mykodiesel. So still a lot of research going on this. I know that Gary Strobel in his lab was able to go through and actually get it to produce fuel that he was able to then burn. NPR did do a little story on this quite a while back. They interviewed him, must have been at least 10 years ago. And there's other work that's been done on it. So I know that the topic has kind of somewhat fizzled out, but I still think that it's super interesting, if not nothing more than a case study of how much we don't know about the chemicals and different constituents that comprise a lot of the fungi that we see out here commonly. You know, there could be a plethora of things that we could use these various species for, you know, everything from biofuels to medicines to foods and green chemicals and all that kind of stuff. So interesting what we know, but even more interesting to ponder what we don't know. So this again, the purple Jellydisc, very common, occurs around the world and known to produce Mykodiesel, just not at big enough a scale yet to be commercially feasible. But the big benefit of that is that whereas other biofuels like ethanols, they require sugar, right, to produce a usable fuel source. Whereas, you know, if this were really understood well enough, the processes by which this produces our carbon fuels, it would do just fine with, you know, a lot of agricultural waste products, wood chips, other stuff that doesn't necessarily require as much expense and labor as these sugar sources. So interesting stuff. When I'm out in the forest, I'm always keeping my eye out for what's changing. And as I look here, I notice that there's a big leaf maple that recently came down, kind of fell over this trail, and has been kind of brushed aside. You know, obviously some chainsaw activity here to free up the trail a little bit. But what I tend to think about is what mushrooms might show up here as a result of this big leaf maple coming down. So there are several saprophytic mushrooms that love hardwood. So, you know, I just kind of try to make that mental note. Hey, maybe check back here within the next year or two and see what we're seeing in terms of maybe some wild Enoki mushrooms or perhaps some turkey tail or other things. So just something to always be considering or thinking about. As I move down the trail here, I pick up a little flash of color over here, and looks to be turkey tail. So even though it's late January, not a typical time that I would even look to necessarily be harvesting a lot of mushrooms, you see this growing out of what appears to be a downed big leaf maple. And if we check underneath here, very white, small pores. The fact that it's still bright white in color tells me that this is a fresh good specimen that would be excellent to harvest. Now, of course, turkey tail is one of the most studied medicinal mushrooms, actually the most studied medicinal mushroom on the planet, and one that I happen to consume on a regular basis, especially in the fall and winter time. So I may go ahead and harvest a few of these. Quick little reminder here, the cap is going to feel velvety to the touch, so there's small little hairs here. There are a lot of similar saprophytic mushrooms that grow from dead and decaying wood, but all of the common lookalikes will lack this white pore surface, and those are really small pores that you really have to squint to see, but that's a differentiating factor that is really good when you're trying to positively ID this one in the field. So hopefully that's helpful. Well, I'll go ahead and harvest some of this and throw it in some decoction or just kind of like a slow cooked tea for this evening. Even though it's late January and there may not be a lot of mushrooms out currently in terms of fruiting bodies that I can take to the table, I'm always thinking about what's next. And when I look down at the ground here, I'm noticing these distinct leaves and these twigs right here with a bud on it that's very distinct and that I'm sure some of you recognize. These are the leaves and twigs of the black cottonwood, which is our cottonwood species that's out here in the Pacific Northwest. And if we look at this tree, this is kind of the source of those leaves and twigs, great big black cottonwood. And what I'm thinking about is not necessarily what's coming up right now, but what I know is going to come up over the course of the next few months. So come mid-late April, I know that this is going to be the spot where I'm going to be most likely to find morels coming up. So specifically the early morels, the Verpa species, which are not true Morellus species, but a choice edible nonetheless, Verpa bohemica, the thimble morel, or sometimes they're called early morels. This is the exact spot that I'll check back on in a few months' time to see if I have any luck. So just something to be thinking about, even though we're not necessarily finding those morels right now. I'm thinking about, okay, they may well be popping up here over the course of the next few months. So something to consider even during these cold, wet, rainy periods of the winter in the Northwest. Looks like up here we have another fruiting of turkey tail on this log. So we've got another, looks like what was likely a red alder log, so another hardwood or deciduous piece of wood here that's a nice little fruiting of turkey tail. Again, for January, typically I'll harvest these in the fall time and dry them out, but this year has been so mild that I'm noticing that, you know, we're getting relatively fresh, nice turkey tail fruitings in January. And this is one that, you know, it's prolific. We see it all over the place, and it does fruit all year round. So I never feel the need or urgency to kind of over harvest this. A lot of times I'll just take what'll fit in my pocket and throw it in the pot for a tea any given night. Just kind of throw it on the stove, let it boil a couple hours. So interesting to see this one, and we can tell that, you know, we're getting really fresh fruiting bodies coming out. Again, this year's been kind of unusual. We had one hard freeze last week, but now it's starting to warm up again. So interesting to see what these mushrooms do with that weather situation. And actually just up the trail, literally within feet of the turkey tail, we've got a prime example of false turkey tail, the Stereum genus. And we can see that this also has a similar pattern, right? Like we can see some banded colors, also a white margin, flimsy growing off the side. Now, one thing is that this is curling up just a little bit. It may be difficult to tell from the video, but you can kind of see how it tends to curl up. Also, it's a little bit thinner, so a little flimsier, not quite as tough or thick as the other. And then the main distinguishing feature is going to reveal itself when we flip this over. So you can see underneath we've got more of like an orangish smooth surface as opposed to that white tiny pored surface. There's actually no pores here Stereum genus, there's a few different species. This is probably what's known as rusty curtain or Stereum hirsutum. And it's actually a crust fungus. So it's not actually a polypore, it's a different type of mushroom, but oftentimes confused with turkey tail, especially when people are looking for this one to create their own medicines at home. Oftentimes there's a lot of confusion with this. So important to note that this one is non-toxic, so it's not a huge threat if you do accidentally throw this one into the pot. I'm not aware of any immediate danger there, and in fact I've heard that this is probably medicinal as well. It's just not as well researched or studied as turkey tail, our most studied medicinal on the planet. So something to keep an eye out for, and good to be able to identify both and to be able to differentiate between the two. Not sure how it's been in other parts of the country this year, but what I can say is here in the Pacific Northwest, it's really been a bumper year for mushrooms. And first time I can remember harvesting golden chanterelles, Pacific golden chanterelles, straight through the new year. Usually, you know, one really hard frost that lasts for several days will eliminate those, or, you know, end the fruiting season. But this year it held out so long that we had fruiting straight through the winter and into the new year, which again, I can't remember that ever happening. So definitely an incredible mushroom year. Hopefully there's more similar years to follow. And there's still stuff out here though, even though we've gotten our hard frost now. So, you know, as far as I can see, the chanterelles and a lot of the choice edibles that we were also excited to be harvesting so late in the year, they've kind of come and gone and run their course, but there's still interesting things to find, and there's always something, so keep looking. Just on the side of the trail here is a pretty good example of a really common polypore. In fact, probably the most common polypore up here in the Pacific Northwest. This is known as the red belted conch, Fomitopsis mounceae, and this is actually just growing right out of a dug fir log, so we can actually see bigger fruiting bodies down here. And anyone who's walked around the woods in the Pacific Northwest has gotten pretty accustomed to seeing this on a routine basis. In fact, we can see it coming out of that standing snag there. Very, very common. Also a medicinal one. So I've read literature citing or referencing that indigenous tribes in the area would routinely use this for kind of seasonal illnesses, cough, cold, flu, things like that, just boosting the immune system during these fall and winter times. The preparation for that would be similar to what we do with Reishi or turkey tail. It would just be a hot water extraction. So basically slicing this up. It's a very hard mushroom, so you got to kind of work at it. It's not soft like other fruiting bodies might be, so it can sometimes be difficult to work with in that regard, but just slice it up, throw it into a pot, bring it to a boil, let it simmer for a couple hours, and that's just kind of your most basic hot water extract. Definitely a good one, definitely some medicinal content in there, so if you haven't tried it, give it a whirl. Let me know what you think. Looking up this standing snag, just kind of a cool view of one of these red belted conchs. Again, very common out here. Most common conch that you'll see. You can see that growing on this small dug fir, just all by its lonesome, but a pretty handsome guy. Just came across another small dug fir snag, and again, red belted conch. This one's kind of interesting. Look at this growth pattern on this. So clearly this one fell. It was originally growing horizontal to the ground, but once it fell, that shifted, so it started a new growth, which gives it this kind of crazy look to it. We can see kind of a similar thing going on down here. It's another kind of cool thing to observe about these ones. Was just running along the trail, and this one really jumped out at me, caught my attention. It's a classic example of Stereum, the false turkey tail. We can see how it kind of curls up. It's got this orangish kind of banding pattern. You can see how it's like a little kind of uplifted and a little frivolly at the edges. When we turn this over, we can see this is a really old one. Still pretty vibrant, actually, so I guess it's not that old. Just had a little growth under that other one, but we can see that's a smooth, so it's lacking pores, orange in color. And if we look just across the trail over here, this is the really interesting thing about this, is we see the one that people are oftentimes looking for that's confused with. So over here on this log, we see true turkey tail, Trametes versicolor. So the other one's Stereum genus, it's actually a crust fungus, whereas this is a true polypore. So if we look underneath, and again, some of this is a little older, but if you look closely, you're gonna see a pored surface, fine white pores. Let's actually zoom in and take a closer look here. So we can see, and that one's got a little age on it, right? It's a little spotted. But if you were to look really closely, and you do have to squint to see them, they're not large pores, they're very fine pores. But this turkey tail is gonna be pored. And similar to the Stereum, it's gonna feel a little velvety, it's got hairs. It's a little thicker, a little more leathery than the Stereum. The Stereum's a little flimsier, but something to really be on the lookout for. If you haven't checked out Christopher Hobbs's book on medicinal mushrooms, I'd highly recommend it. The most studied medicinal mushroom on the planet right here, turkey tail. And literally within feet of the turkey tail and the Stereum, we've got not just a red belted conch, but if we shift our attention down here, you'll notice something, may or may not catch your eye, but this is a very cool medicinal mushroom. Now this one is certainly past its prime. This is more of like kind of a late summer, fall mushroom. But this is the West Coast Reishi. Really incredible mushroom that is one of my absolute favorites to find. So this is known as Ganoderma oregonensis. And this is one that I consume virtually every day. So I do a hot water extract of this one, oftentimes along with turkey tail, and it has incredible immune boosting properties. So this is gonna have a white pored surface underneath, especially when it's fresh. The top is gonna have kind of like a little bit of a shine to it. And what's unique about this, so different than our red belted conch that's up here, this thing is just gonna grow year after year. It's gonna get bigger and bigger. This one is kind of much different because it's just going to come out seasonally each year. And now this fruiting body is no longer really useful. And you can kind of see it's kind of squishy, whereas that red belted conch would be quite firm, actually hard as a rock, if I'm honest. But this is actually in the process of just kind of decaying. It's probably being consumed by all kinds of bugs and different things like that. But this is known as the mushroom of longevity, and it's an incredible mushroom. There's a very common species that's been used in traditional Chinese medicine for thousands of years. So really a good one to keep an eye out for. Out here, it tends to favor hemlock. This is not the same species as Ganoderma sugae, which will grow on the East Coast. That one only grows on hemlock. This one prefers hemlock, but I have seen it on Doug fir on rare occasions. So we'll hopefully track down lots of this come late summer, early fall. So good one to know. Keep an eye out for it. Looks super vibrant, even cooler when it's fresh, but we can still identify it this time of year too. So neat stuff. These guys here really stand out, and I'm sure these are familiar sights to many of you living out here in the Pacific Northwest. So these are growing off of Doug fir log, very distinct, very much stand out. This is a type of jelly fungus. These are collectively known as witch's butter. So there's actually 3 distinct species. This one that grows on Doug fir, it's gonna have a unique attachment. So if we look at this, it kind of connects at a single point. So you can kind of see that there. That's a Dacrymyces. So others are in the Tremella genus. But anyways, collectively, most people just refer to these all as witch's butter, regardless of the species. And they're not easily confused with other mushrooms. They're all edible, not necessarily choice. They don't have a lot of flavor, but they kind of have a gelatinous texture that sometimes people can find off-putting, but they're oftentimes used to thicken soups and stews, and they've been used medicinally in traditional Chinese medicine for quite some time. So definitely some medicinal properties, and a lot of people will take these and use them to creatively produce different types of fruit leather type edibles by soaking them in fruit juices and then partially dehydrating them and having a little snack that way. So could be a fun thing to try out. One last thing, so these, I obviously wouldn't necessarily consider munching on, especially the ones that are faded. They seem a little past their prime, but when they're fresh and young, you can actually eat these raw. So sometimes I'll pop these in my mouth. They're oftentimes referred to as the poor man's gumdrop. Bit of an acquired taste, but I like them. Another common saprophyte, very common to see this time of year. This is known as the Rosy Conk. Rhodofomes is the genus. I believe Rhodofomes cajanderi. I'll put the name on the screen. I forget. I'm probably messing up that pronunciation, but very common. Oftentimes very red. Sometimes it'll have guttation on it, so like a little sweat from the mushroom. So an interesting one, a pretty one to look at, especially when it's young and fresh and be pink or red in color. This one's a little further along, so a little darker in color, less fun to look at, but these are abundant, and I'm sure if you look for them, you'll see them. So these are far past their prime, but use this one to illustrate kind of something to look for. So we can see that the gills underneath have an almost orangish hue. Sometimes they're white or cream. They kind of change with age. But growing from hardwood, and this is Sarcoides serratina, the late oyster, also known as the green oyster, late fall oyster, or even winter oyster. So it goes by many names. If you're in Japan, this would be referred to as the Mykodiesel. And curiously enough, there's a lot of opinions here. Not everyone loves this. It's kind of somewhat firm, somewhat bitter. Depends on how fresh it is. These are way past their prime. I wouldn't even consider eating them. But if this were younger, I would consider eating it. And not only is it rich in umami, but it also has a lot of medicinal properties. So specifically, this is used for its liver protective qualities and to treat non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So definitely a good medicinal. And again, in Japan, they love this as a choice edible as well. Rich in umami, just needs to be prepared or cooked correctly. So this one needs to be cooked a long time to really get a good edible experience out of this one. So if you haven't tried it, give it a whirl. It might be a little late out here this time of year. I'm sure you can find some that are a little fresher than these. These have been out for a while. So it's one that I'll keep my eyes peeled for, and it's not afraid of the cold weather, so it should still do fine even in the cold, but we are getting a little late into the season for any of these edible mushrooms. So we'll see what the days, weeks, and months bring. Well, that about does it for today's run/mushroom exploration. We got a few miles, got a few mushrooms. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. Maybe you learned something along the way. Thanks for joining me out here on the mushroom trail, and until next time, happy trails.